Hello, beautiful souls. I'm Dr. Carrie Meridian, and welcome back to the Meridian Astrology Forecast. Each week, we spend a little time together looking at what's happening in the sky. Not because astrology determines our future, but because I believe it can help us understand ourselves more deeply and ultimately help us return to ourselves. And this week feels especially important because last week we moved through the energy many people associate with the Lionsgate portal. We talked about intention, courage, stepping into our light, and becoming the person we've been waiting for. But now, the portal begins to close behind us. And almost immediately, we move into eclipse energy. So if last week was about asking for the new chapter, this week asks something very different. Are you ready to become the person who can actually live it? Let's talk about it. So the Lionsgate closes. Now what? Maybe during the Lionsgate, you set an intention. Maybe you journaled. Maybe you asked for love, abundance, purpose, healing, a career opportunity, a new beginning. Or maybe you simply asked to feel like yourself again. But eventually, manifestation has to move beyond asking. And at some point, we have to participate. And that's where this week begins. Instead of only asking, what do I want? Try asking, who do I need to become to receive what I'm asking for? Because sometimes we ask for a new life while continuing to make choices from an old identity. And those two things cannot coexist forever. Maybe the Lionsgate wasn't simply about something coming towards you. Maybe it was about awakening something within you. And now the astrology begins asking what you're going to do with it. And interestingly enough, the first shift of this week has everything to do with finding our voice. So, Mercury moves into Leo. Mercury represents our thoughts, our communication, our ideas, and even the stories we tell ourselves. Leo speaks from the heart. It wants expression, creativity, confidence, and authenticity. So there's something beautiful about Mercury moving into Leo right now. Maybe you've spent the last several weeks questioning something, reconsidering a decision, replaying conversations, wondering what you really think or what you really want. And now Mercury in Leo says, say it. Not recklessly, not dramatically, but authentically. Because there is a difference between speaking loudly and speaking truthfully. So what does this mean for us? Notice where you've been editing yourself. Where have you been afraid to say what you actually think? Where have you made your voice smaller because you were worried about how someone else might respond? And where have you been waiting for permission to say, this is what I want? This is what I believe. Returning to yourself sometimes begins with allowing yourself to have a voice again. But speaking our truth can also stir emotion. And that brings us beautifully into the next energy of the week because Mars is changing signs too. Mars is moving into Cancer. Mars represents action, drive, desire, your motivation. But Cancer represents home, family, memory, emotional security, and belonging. So while Mercury is encouraging us to speak from the heart, Mars in Cancer asks us to pay attention to what happens inside the heart. We may become fiercely protective of the people and the things we care about, but we may also become more reactive when we don't feel emotionally safe. So what does this mean for us? This week, notice the difference between responding and reacting. Something may touch an old wound. Someone may say something that reminds you of something from your past, and suddenly you're not only responding to what's happening today, you are responding to everything that came before it. And when that happens, instead of immediately reacting, ask yourself, what am I actually protecting right now? My peace? My boundaries? My dignity? Or an old wound that still believes it has the right to survive? That question alone can change everything, because returning to yourself doesn't mean never being triggered. It means learning how to recognize when your past is trying to be in your present. Because on Wednesday, the sky goes dark. On Wednesday, August 12th, we have a total solar eclipse in Leo. And this is the heart of this week's astrology. A solar eclipse occurs during a new moon, when the moon moves between the earth and the sun. Astrologically, eclipses have been long associated with turning points, revelations, beginnings, endings, and changes that may unfold over time rather than all at once. And this eclipse is happening in Leo. Leo represents creativity, courage, leadership, visibility, self-expression, joy, and the heart. So the question we've been asking throughout the Leo season suddenly becomes so much louder. Where are you still hiding? And I don't think this eclipse is asking, how can I become more impressive? I think it's asking, how can I become more authentic? Because those two are very different things. You can receive applause and still feel disconnected from yourself. You can achieve something and still wonder why it doesn't feel fulfilling. You can even be loved and still feel lonely, if the person being loved isn't actually the real you. And that is where this eclipse connects so beautifully to returning to yourself. Leo reminds us that there is a difference between performing who we think we're supposed to be and actually living who we are. Maybe you've spent years being the responsible one, the agreeable one, the caretaker, the achiever, the strong one, the person everybody could depend on. And maybe somewhere along the way, you forgot to ask, who am I when I'm not trying to be what everybody else needs me to be? This is an eclipse question, and I would not rush to answer it, because sometimes the most important answers need time to find us. So what do we do with the eclipse energy? And this is important because we've just come through Lion's Gate, where there has been so much conversation about intention and manifestation. Eclipse energy feels different. Rather than trying to force something into existence, I think this is a beautiful time to listen. You don't need to make something happen. You don't need to demand a sign. And you certainly don't need to have your entire future figured out by Wednesday afternoon. Instead of saying, universe, give me exactly what I want, maybe the invitation becomes, show me what I'm finally ready to see. And then listen, because what you discover may not be what you expected. It may be better. And there's another layer to this eclipse that makes the symbolism even more interesting, because this new moon beginning is happening during a year centered around completion, the universal year 9. In numerology, 2026 is a universal year 9. 9 represents completion, release, wisdom, forgiveness, and endings that prepare us for another beginning. And think about the symbolism here. We have a new moon solar eclipse, right? Which speaks to beginnings. Inside a universal year 9, which speaks to completions, beginnings and endings existing at the same time. And isn't that how life actually works? Very rarely do we completely finish one chapter, tie a perfect little bow around it, and then peacefully begin another. Usually, one door is still closing while another one begins to open. So what does this mean for us? Maybe you don't need to know exactly what's coming next. Maybe you simply need to recognize what cannot come with you. An old belief, an old relationship pattern, an old identity, an old definition of success, an old belief about what you deserve, an old version of yourself that once kept you safe, but now keeps you small. Returning to yourself sometimes means honoring who you used to be, while still recognizing that you don't have to remain her forever. So ask yourself, what am I carrying simply because I carried it for a long time? Because history is not the same thing as destiny. You are allowed to put something down. And then the energy begins to shift. And after all of this reflection, after all of the release and eclipse energy, the week ends on a very different note. Suddenly, our minds begin looking forward again. Our voices become bigger, our ideas become bigger, and perhaps our belief in ourselves becomes a little bigger too. Because Mercury meets Jupiter in Leo. Mercury represents our thoughts, right? And our voice. Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And Leo says, create, express, believe, be seen. This can be beautiful energy for writing, teaching, speaking, creating, sharing an idea, or simply imagining possibilities you couldn't see before. But Jupiter can also make everything bigger, including our promises. So yes, dream big, but stay grounded. So what does this mean for us? After an eclipse that asks us who we really are, Mercury and Jupiter give us an opportunity to begin telling a new story about ourselves, not pretending everything is perfect, not creating some fantasy version of ourselves, but changing the language we use to describe our lives. Instead of saying, I'm too old, maybe say, I'm experienced. Instead of saying, I failed, maybe say, I learned. Instead of saying, I have to start over, maybe say, I get to begin differently. Words matter, especially the words we repeatedly use to describe ourselves. So ask yourself, what story about myself am I ready to stop repeating? Because maybe you've already outgrown it. So when I step back and I look at everything happening this week, the closing of Lion's Gate, Mercury finding its voice, Mars stirring our emotions, the Leo solar eclipse, the completion energy of the universal year 9, and Mercury and Jupiter encouraging us to imagine something bigger, I see one continuous story. It's time to stop rehearsing your old identity. Last week we asked, who would I become if I truly felt already giving enough? This week, we take that question one step further. What version of myself must I finally release so the person I'm becoming has room to grow? That is a reflection question for this week. Don't rush the answer. Write it down. Sit with it. Notice what comes up, because sometimes returning to yourself doesn't feel like finding something new. Sometimes it feels like taking off layer after layer after layer until eventually you recognize the person who was underneath them all along. Thank you for spending part of your week with me on the Meridian Astrology Forecast, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What story about yourself are you ready to stop carrying? Until next time, remember, the stars may illuminate the path, but you are the one who chooses to walk it. Keep looking to the stars and keep returning to yourself.